My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I am the president of Burkina Faso, a land that many in the world know only through headlines of conflict, poverty, or instability, but which I know first through faces, voices, and long silences. I speak today not as a symbol, not as an argument, but as a man who carries responsibility that does not sleep when the body does. Burkina Faso stands where much of Africa stands. We are young in population, old in memory, and burdened by histories we did not choose, but must still answer for. Our soil is rich, yet our people have known hunger. Our faith is strong, yet our divisions are real. Muslims and Christians pray under the same sky, often for the same mercy, while leaders like myself struggle to turn prayer into policy without losing our souls in the process. Outwardly, my country still functions. Ministries open their doors, security briefings are delivered on time, the machinery of leadership continues to move. Yet inwardly, across the Sahel and beyond it, something quieter is breaking down. It is not order, but trust, not authority, but meaning. We are learning how to survive without learning how to remain just. The night of the dream came after no public disaster. There was no coup, no attack, no announcement that shook the nation. It followed an ordinary evening of work that stretched too long, conversations that solved little, and decisions postponed because they felt safer tomorrow than today. I returned home after midnight, my body heavy, my mind louder than the room. I did not kneel to pray as I once did. I told myself that God understood fatigue. I lay down still dressed, meaning only to rest my eyes. Somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, between duty and escape, the dream came to me. It did not arrive with fear. It arrived with clarity. The place where I found myself was unfamiliar, yet it carried no strangeness. There were no walls, no horizon, no sense of distance. Light existed without a source. Silence existed without absence. It felt less like a place I had entered and more like a place that had been waiting for me. I was not afraid. That surprised me. As a leader, fear often comes disguised as calculation, but here there was nothing to calculate. I stood as I was, without title, without uniform, without the protection of explanation. He appeared without announcement. There was no radiance around him, no spectacle, no separation between him and the space we shared. He did not stand above me or before me. He stood beside me, close enough that I could feel presence without touch. His face carried neither severity nor comfort, only attention. I knew who he was before any word was spoken, not because I had been taught, but because recognition does not require instruction. He did not ask my name. He did not list my failures. He did not speak of enemies, elections, or history. His voice, when it came, was calm, almost weary, as if he had spoken these words many times to many men like me. "You are tired," he said. I wanted to explain. I wanted to justify the weight, the pressure, the context that never appears in judgment, but he did not pause for response. "You are not tired because the work is too heavy," he continued. "You are tired because you are carrying what was never given to you." I felt something tighten in my chest, not guilt, recognition. He showed me no images yet. No future, no punishment, no reward. Only a question that felt heavier than accusation. "At what point," he asked, "did you begin to believe that delay was wisdom and silence was patience?" I had no answer, not because none existed, but because the true one had never been spoken aloud. He did not condemn me. He waited. And in that waiting, I understood that this was not a dream about what would happen to my country. It was about what was already happening to me. The hunger that was not caused by drought. The space around us shifted without movement. I was not taken anywhere, yet I was made to see. Fields appeared, dry but not ruined. Granaries stood nearby, not empty, only locked. Roads existed, but they led in circles. This was not a land struck by disaster. This was a land managed into hunger. Jesus did not raise his voice. He did not point. He simply spoke as one, stating what had already been observed. "Famine," he said, "is rarely born from the sky alone." I saw men in offices far from the soil. They spoke of logistics, of timing, of stability. Grain was delayed because releasing it too early might weaken leverage. Aid was slowed because it might empower the wrong group. Hunger was measured, calculated, tolerated. None of these men called themselves cruel. I recognized the language. I had used parts of it myself. Words like later, soon, after the situation stabilizes. Each one sounded reasonable. Each one bought time. Each one cost lives that never appeared in reports. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, the kind that comes before tears but does not permit them. I wanted to argue that leadership requires trade-offs, that feeding everyone immediately is not always possible, that security must come first. Jesus did not contradict me. He asked only one thing. Who told you, he said, that hunger can wait without changing the people who endure it? I saw mothers thinning meals, not from scarcity but from uncertainty. I saw children learning early that promises are fragile. I saw resentment grow quietly, not against God, but against leaders who spoke of patience from full tables. This is how trust dies, he said, not through betrayal but through postponement. The famine he showed me did not begin with drought. It began with leaders learning to live comfortably beside suffering, convincing themselves that restraint was wisdom. I understood then that no enemy had to attack us to weaken us. We were doing it ourselves, carefully, politely, one delayed decision at a time. The vision faded, but the question remained. How many hungers had I already justified? The fields dissolved, and in their place rose buildings meant for healing, clinics with painted signs, hospitals with long corridors and shorter patients. I could smell disinfectant mixed with something older, something neglected. Illness was present, but it was not the first thing I noticed. What struck me was the waiting. People waited with papers in their hands and pain in their bodies. Some waited for medicine that existed but was priced beyond them. Others waited for attention that had been redirected elsewhere. No one shouted. No one protested. They had learned the discipline of quiet suffering. Jesus walked beside me as if this were familiar ground. Disease, he said, often arrives after morality has already left. I wanted to object. Illness is natural, I thought. Bodies fail. Viruses do not ask permission. But as I looked closer, I saw that this sickness had pathways. Corruption had weakened the walls long before infection entered. Supplies were siphoned. Positions were sold. Care became conditional. Health had become a privilege instead of a responsibility. I saw a minister approve a budget reduction with steady hands. He told himself the funds were needed elsewhere. I saw a supplier dilute medicine to increase profit. He told himself, everyone does it. I saw leaders praise efficiency while nurses rationed compassion because there was nothing left to give. None of this looked violent. That was the danger. When medicine becomes a market, Jesus said, illness stops being an accident. It becomes a verdict. I felt the weight of it settle in me. I had spoken of reform. I had demanded reports. I had trusted systems that rewarded loyalty more than truth. Each choice had seemed minor. Each consequence had multiplied beyond my sight. I watched a man leave a clinic carrying nothing but a diagnosis, no treatment, no hope. He did not curse the state. He simply adjusted his expectations downward, the way people do when disappointment becomes routine. This is how a nation's body weakens, Jesus said. Not from disease alone, but from the quiet decision that some lives can be delayed. I understood then that healing cannot begin where honesty is absent. No amount of power can cure what power protects. We did not move, yet the scene changed again. I was shown accounts, documents, signatures, meetings that lasted less than an hour and altered decades. Nothing dramatic happened here. No soldiers, no shouting. Only pens, approvals, and the soft language of entitlement. Jesus did not sound angry. That disturbed me more than anger would have. Public wealth, he said, is rarely stolen in one night. I watched resources meant for schools redirected through lawful channels. I watched contracts awarded to familiar names, not because they were best, but because they were safe. Each action had justification. Each justification had precedent. Each precedent created permission. I recognized the structure immediately. It was not chaos, it was order without conscience. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to say that I had not taken anything, that my hands were clean, that corruption existed before me and would exist after me. But the vision was not about guilt in the legal sense, it was about consent. I saw leaders notice irregularities and decide to address them later. I saw advisors warn softly and then fall silent when silence was rewarded. I saw myself listening, nodding, postponing, choosing continuity over confrontation. This is how the common good is stolen, Jesus said, not by villains but by guardians who grow tired. The theft did not look like greed, it looked like fatigue. Like the slow lowering of standards, because enforcing them required conflict, because insisting on integrity meant risking alliances, because saying no too often meant standing alone. I felt a sharp awareness settle in me. I had believed that holding the center was responsibility, that avoiding rupture was leadership. But I was seeing now that every time I allowed a small injustice to pass, I was teaching others how to do the same. The poor, he said, are robbed long before they are hungry. I understood then that corruption does not begin with desire, it begins with tolerance. And tolerance, once practiced, does not remain selective. The vision did not accuse me directly, it did something worse. It made me see myself clearly. The documents faded, and I felt the weight of authority return to my shoulders. Not as honor, but as armor. I was shown a chamber I knew well. A place of briefings, guarded entrances, controlled language. Here, everything was orderly. Too orderly. Jesus stood still while the room arranged itself around us. This, he said, is where service begins to turn inward. I watched myself enter meetings surrounded by security. Not because danger was imminent, but because caution had become habit. The people outside the gates were not enemies, yet distance had grown between us. Not physical distance, emotional distance. The kind that forms when leaders stop listening and start managing perception. I heard my own voice explaining restraint, explaining why certain protests could not be allowed, while certain voices had to be contained for stability. Every word sounded responsible. Every decision seemed defensible. That is how power speaks when it forgets, Jesus said. I felt resistance rise in me. I told myself that leadership requires survival, that losing authority helps no one, that staying in position allows gradual change. These arguments had carried me far. He did not dismiss them. Power, he said quietly, fails the moment it begins to protect itself more carefully than it protects its people. I saw laws applied unevenly, not out of hatred but convenience. I saw advisors discourage uncomfortable truths, not because they were false, but because they complicated plans. I saw myself accepting these filters, telling myself I would address deeper reforms later. Later had become a shelter. The danger here was subtle. Nothing looked oppressive yet. Order remained, institutions functioned, but something essential was being traded away. Leadership had become about continuity, not courage. You are not called to be secure, Jesus said. You are called to be faithful. That word cut through me. Faithful, not effective, not admired, not preserved. I realized then how easily stability can become an idol. How quickly the fear of collapse convinces leaders to cling to power, rather than risk it for justice. I understood that forgetting who power serves does not happen in a moment of arrogance. It happens in a season of fear. The chamber dissolved, and what replaced it was not a battlefield but a series of conversations, small gatherings, private rooms, tribal councils, religious meetings, none of them violent, all of them careful. Jesus allowed me to hear what was being said. I heard leaders choose language that pleased their own people while wounding the truth. I heard appeals to history used not to heal but to justify resentment. I heard fear spoken softly, disguised as concern for identity, tradition, and survival. No one plans a civil war, Jesus said. They prepare the ground for it. I watched how grievance was nurtured, how leaders avoided correcting lies because the lies mobilized loyalty, how silence was chosen when correction would cost popularity. Each decision seemed small. Each one felt understandable. I recognized myself again. I had told myself that unity must be preserved, that naming injustice too clearly could fracture the nation, that waiting for the right moment was wisdom. But the right moment, he said, does not arrive on its own. I saw young men absorbing narratives of betrayal. I saw communities retreat into identity, not because they hated others, but because no one had spoken truth strongly enough to protect them from fear. Weapons appeared later, long after words had already done their work. Conflict, Jesus said, begins when leaders choose tribe over truth. The pain I felt then was not abstract, it was personal. I had believed neutrality could keep peace. I saw now that neutrality, when injustice is present, is a form of participation. Civil war, I learned, is not an explosion, it is an erosion. And leaders are often the first to look away. What followed was not chaos, but distance. Borders appeared, not as lines on maps, but as pauses in cooperation. Neighboring nations stood close enough to touch, yet turned slightly away from one another, each calculating risk, each guarding advantage. Jesus looked at the space between them. This gap, he said, is where weakness grows. I was shown meetings between Sahel leaders where courtesy replaced candor, smiles replaced solidarity. Agreements were drafted thin enough to avoid commitment. Each nation told itself it could survive alone, that dependence was danger, that unity was idealistic. The arguments were familiar. Cooperation is slow.
Je pense que ce
Trust is
problème est
fragile.
plus ou moins résolu.
History is complicated.
Tous ceux qui sont VDP
Every
dans les
reason
villages
sounded
aujourd'hui
wise.
ont des armes.
And every reason, Jesus said, is expensive. I saw how shared threats multiplied when faced separately, how resources meant to protect all were hoarded by some, how external powers found openings not through force but through invitation, offering help that carried conditions only visible later. Division, he said, is the most efficient weapon ever invented against Africa. I felt the weight of that truth settle into me. We spoke often of sovereignty, yet we practiced isolation. We feared exploitation, yet we made ourselves vulnerable by standing apart. The price of disunity was not paid immediately. That was its deception. It was paid slowly, through lost leverage, delayed responses, and a growing sense that no one was truly accountable to anyone else. I understood then that unity is not sentimental, it is strategic, and refusing it does not preserve independence. It sells it quietly. The space widened, and lines appeared beneath our feet. They were borders, but not the kind drawn cleanly on paper. These lines pulsed like old wounds. They shifted, opened, closed again. They were meant to protect, yet they leaked. Jesus knelt and touched one of them. Borders, he said, become scars when cooperation collapses. I watched refugees move before I saw soldiers. Families crossed not with strategy but with desperation. They carried what could be held, which is always less than what is lost. Behind them came arms, resentment, and rumors. Ahead of them waited suspicion. I had spoken often about securing borders. It sounded responsible. It sounded strong. But what I was being shown was not a failure of fences. It was a failure of trust. When nations stop speaking honestly to one another, borders harden in the wrong places. Aid slows. Intelligence fragments. You cannot seal what you refuse to share, Jesus said. I saw checkpoints where officials enforced rules without understanding their purpose. I saw communities split by lines they did not draw, punished for conflicts they did not choose. The border no longer served the people, it served the anxiety of leaders. This bleeding did not announce itself. It appeared gradually, as resentment on one side and exhaustion on the other, and soon the border itself became an actor, shaping lives instead of protecting them. I understood then that security without solidarity is an illusion. It protects authority, not people. The borders faded, and I felt something more unsettling than danger. I felt absence, not physical absence, but a withdrawal that had already taken place. I was shown a leader's office again, but this time it was empty of meaning. The chair was occupied, the desk was in use, yet the man inside had already begun to leave. Jesus looked at me, not with accusation, but with something close to grief. Before people flee their homes, he said, a leader often flees responsibility. I did not want to accept this. I had not abandoned my post. I had not resigned. I had not escaped. Yet as I watched, I saw myself retreat in smaller ways, avoiding conversations that demanded moral clarity, delegating decisions that required courage, replacing engagement with procedure. I had learned how to remain visible while becoming unavailable. The withdrawal was emotional before it was political. I had protected myself from disappointment by lowering expectation. I had protected my heart from conflict by narrowing my attention. None of this looked like cowardice. It looked like professionalism. That is why it is dangerous, Jesus said. I saw leaders who still attended meetings but no longer listened, who still spoke of the people but no longer felt them, who still made decisions but only within the safest boundaries. They had not fled the nation. They had fled the risk of conscience. Withdrawal feels like survival, but what survives is not leadership, only position. You cannot lead from a place you have already left, he said. That sentence stayed with me. I understood then that exile does not always require borders. Sometimes it requires only fear and fatigue. The leader becomes the first refugee when he chooses distance over presence, caution over truth, endurance over integrity. And once that happens, others will follow. The silence that followed was heavy, not empty. Faces began to appear, not as a crowd, but one by one. Ordinary faces. Farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, mothers, elders. None of them shouted. None of them accused with anger. That was what made it unbearable. Jesus did not speak at first. He let me listen. I heard complaints that were never filed. I heard questions that were never asked publicly because people had learned they would not be answered. I heard hope expressed once, then repeated more quietly, then finally abandoned without ceremony. They are not accusing you of cruelty, Jesus said. They are accusing you of absence. That struck deeper than any charge of abuse could have. I had not ordered violence against them. I had not deliberately harmed them. I had simply not been there when courage was required. I had spoken carefully when clarity was needed. I had chosen process when they needed presence. I saw moments when a single word from leadership could have protected the vulnerable. I had chosen silence to avoid escalation. I had told myself that restraint was wisdom. Silence, he said, is not neutral when power is listening. I felt shame then, not because I was exposed, but because I understood. These people did not expect perfection. They expected recognition. They needed to know they were seen, not managed. I watched a woman stop bringing her concerns forward because no one ever responded. I watched a young man turn toward anger because patience had become humiliation. I watched trust decay without noise. This is how people disappear, Jesus said. Long before they leave, they conclude they do not matter. The cry I failed to hear was not loud enough for reports. It was not dramatic enough for speeches, but it was constant. And I had trained myself not to hear it. I understood then that leadership does not fail first in policy. It fails in attention. The faces receded, and what replaced them was noise, not chaos, but judgment. Voices speaking about leadership, about me, about failure and betrayal. Some were fair, some were distorted. All of them carried weight. I had learned to treat condemnation as an enemy, to dismiss it as ignorance, manipulation, or hostility. That instinct had protected me more than once. But here, protection was not what was being offered. Being denounced, Jesus said, is not always injustice. I watched leaders respond to criticism with defensiveness. I watched myself do the same. Every accusation was weighed not for truth, but for threat. If it endangered stability, it was dismissed. If it risked legitimacy, it was countered. Rarely was it listened to. There is a kind of truth, he said, that only arrives through pain. Public condemnation, I saw, functions like a mirror. It is imperfect, it exaggerates, it distorts, but it still reflects something real. Leaders who smash the mirror never see themselves clearly again. I had told myself that listening to critics empowered disorder. I now saw that refusing to listen empowered blindness. The danger was not being judged unfairly. The danger was losing the ability to recognize when judgment was deserved. Some of the voices I heard were angry, some were cruel, but buried within them were questions I had avoided. Why does change take so long? Why does justice feel selective? Why does leadership speak more than it listens? Do not confuse condemnation with hatred, Jesus said. Sometimes it is a final attempt to be heard. I understood then that humility is not weakness in leadership, it is perception. Without it, authority becomes insulated, and insulation breeds decay. The noise softened, and what emerged was order. Streets were quiet, protests had stopped, voices had lowered. At first it looked like peace. Jesus did not react to the calm, he waited. I was shown a future that many leaders secretly desire. Stability restored, dissent contained, the machinery of the state running efficiently, unchallenged. People complied not because they agreed, but because resistance had become costly. This, he said, is fear behaving like peace. I felt the pull of it immediately. Fear simplifies leadership. It shortens conversations. It removes ambiguity. It promises results when patience has failed. I understood why leaders reach for it, often sincerely, often reluctantly. I heard my own reasoning spoken aloud. Security must come first. Order must be restored. Rights can wait. Freedom can be postponed. Once stability is achieved, generosity will return. Every argument sounded logical. Every step felt temporary. And every step, Jesus said, moves the soul. I saw how surveillance replaced trust, how force replaced persuasion, how compliance replaced consent. None of it required hatred, only exhaustion and the belief that people must be controlled for their own good. Fear worked. That was the danger. It delivered obedience quickly. It silenced disorder efficiently. It created the appearance of success. But fear, he said, cannot build what it protects. I watched dignity erode, not in public displays, but in private behavior. People stopped speaking honestly. They learned to perform loyalty. They learned to survive, not to belong. The leader who rules through fear does not lose power immediately. He loses people first, and once that loss is complete, power has nothing left to govern. I understood then that fear offers order at the price of the soul, and once accepted, it demands more every day. What followed did not feel dramatic. That was the most unsettling part. There were no shouting crowds, no burning buildings, no declaration of cruelty. There was only a conversation, calm, rational, persuasive. Jesus, let me hear it clearly. It was the voice of a leader speaking to himself. If we do not act firmly now, we will lose control later. If we allow too much freedom, chaos will follow. If unity is threatened, then liberty must wait. Each sentence sounded responsible. Each one felt mature. None of them spoke of evil. This, Jesus said, is how tyranny begins without ever choosing evil outright. I saw a leader who never intended to become cruel. He wanted to protect his people. He wanted to preserve the nation. He wanted to prevent bloodshed, but he believed that justice could be postponed without cost. He told himself that strong measures were temporary, that exceptional powers would expire, that once stability returned, freedoms would be restored. He believed this sincerely, and that is why it works, Jesus said. I felt myself drawn toward the logic. In moments of danger, moral shortcuts feel like leadership. The world rewards decisiveness, not hesitation. History praises those who maintain order, not those who lose control while defending principle. I watched as each reasonable decision narrowed the future, each delay hardened into policy, each exception became precedent. The leader did not wake up one morning as a tyrant. He simply stopped asking certain questions. At what point does security stop serving justice? At what point does unity become enforced silence? At what point does leadership stop being accountable? These questions, Jesus said, are always asked too late. I understood then that tyranny is not born from hatred. It is born from fear dressed as responsibility, from logic that sounds wise in the moment but corrodes the soul over time. The most dangerous arguments are not the ones that demand cruelty. They are the ones that make cruelty seem unnecessary. The narrow path did not disappear. It widened, not into grandeur, but into responsibility shared. I was no longer alone, yet there were no crowds, only leaders. Faces I recognized and faces I did not. Some were from my region, some from far beyond Africa. All of them carried the same weight behind the eyes. Jesus did not separate us by nation, faith, or title. This, he said, is how the world actually stands. I felt the impulse to ask for greatness, for restoration, for strength that would silence enemies and reassure allies. But the words did not come. What rose instead was a prayer stripped of ambition. I asked for honesty among leaders, not brilliance, not vision, honesty. The courage to say what is failing before it collapses, the humility to admit limits before violence exposes them, the discipline to speak truth when silence feels safer. I asked for patience among the people, not submission. Patience that does not rot into despair. Patience that demands accountability without surrendering hope. Patience that does not confuse endurance with consent. Jesus did not correct the prayer, he refined it. Do not ask for illusion, he said. Ask for sight. I saw Africa not as a continent awaiting rescue, nor as a battlefield of endless crisis, but as a place where moral choices matter as much as material ones, where the future is not stolen only by force, but surrendered through fatigue. I prayed that leaders would stop borrowing stability from tomorrow, that we would stop calling delay wisdom, that we would stop confusing survival with faithfulness. I prayed for Muslims and Christians to resist becoming instruments of fear, for faith to remain a refuge, not a weapon, for God to be named carefully so that his name would not excuse what conscience forbids. There was no promise of triumph, only a quiet assurance that truth spoken early heals more than power exercised late. I understood then that Africa does not need saviors. It needs witnesses. The presence did not leave suddenly. It withdrew the way light does at the end of a long day, not extinguished but entrusted to memory. I was aware again of my body, of the room, of the weight I had tried to escape with sleep. Morning had not yet come, but the night had finished its work. I woke before dawn, not startled, not comforted. Awake in the truest sense of the word. I did not rush to interpret the dream as prophecy. I did not speak of visions or claim authority from it. What I carried was quieter and heavier than revelation. It was responsibility clarified. I speak now to Muslims and Christians, to the leaders of the Sahel, to Africa, to the world, and to all who still believe that leadership must answer to something greater than itself. I do not speak as one who has mastered these truths, but as one who has been interrupted by them. We live in a time that rewards speed over wisdom and certainty over honesty. The world asks leaders to be strong, but rarely asks what that strength is protecting. It praises order, even when that order is purchased with fear. It admires success, even when success is built on small, unspoken compromises. I have learned that evil does not announce itself with horns or flags. It arrives dressed as necessity. Tyrants are not born from hatred alone, but from reasonable arguments made too often, from compromises left unexamined, from leaders who confuse endurance with virtue and silence with peace. I have also learned that justice is not an idea we manage. It is a cost we either accept or avoid, and when we avoid it, the bill does not disappear. It is simply transferred to the poor, the young, the forgotten, and the future. To my fellow leaders, I say this without accusation. Power will always tempt us to protect ourselves first. It will tell us that stability justifies delay, that unity requires silence, that fear is an acceptable substitute for trust. These arguments will sound wise, they will even sound compassionate. That is why they are dangerous. To the people, I do not ask for blind patience, I ask for vigilance without despair. Hold your leaders accountable, but do not surrender your humanity in the process. Cynicism flatters intelligence, but it starves hope. Do not let disappointment teach you that nothing matters. That lesson is the final victory of injustice. To those of faith, Christian and Muslim alike, guard your conscience. God is not served by lies told for order, nor honored by cruelty justified in his name. Faith that excuses injustice is no longer faith. It is fear wearing holy language. I do not ask to be remembered as strong. Strength fades. I do not ask to be praised as successful. Success misleads. I ask only for mercy when I fail, and courage when the right choice feels unreasonable. If this testimony has meaning, it is not because of who speaks it, but because of what it refuses to hide. Leadership is not proven by victory. It is revealed by what we choose when there is no applause left, when the cost is real, and when fear feels reasonable. Each morning, the choice returns. Each day, compromise knocks again. Each day, conscience either speaks or is trained to whisper. And so I end where I must live. Each day I wake up and must choose again. There is no final victory, only awareness or surrender. If these words have stirred something in you, memory, unease, hope, or resistance, do not let it pass unused. Speak with others, reflect, question, stay present. And if you wish to continue this conversation, remain with us, listen again, and walk forward together. Not in certainty, but in truth.